Excellent.
Welcome to another one of our Bruges Group interviews, where we speak to different voices on the challenges Britain and the wider world faces today. I'm Christopher Lim, and I'm an author and contributor with the Bruges Group, and today I have the privilege of hearing from one of the most prominent conservative politicians of today, and in fact a former speaker at one of our conferences, the Right Honourable Peter Lilley, Lord Lilley. Now, Lord Lilley needs no introduction. He was the former Shadow Chancellor and Deputy Leader of the Conservative Party, who shadowed Gordon Brown and John Prescott at the start of the new Labour years, and was in charge of policy renewal under William Hague's leadership. He has served in the Cabinet as Secretary of State for Social Security and Secretary of State for Trade and Industry under Prime Ministers Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and served in the Treasury as Financial Secretary and Economic Secretary, as well as Parliamentary Private Secretary to the then Chancellor Nigel Lawson. He is currently a member of the House of Lords and of the Environment and Climate Change Committee. Lord Lilley, thank you very much for speaking to us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Lord Lilley, I'd like to start on the question of the closure of gas stations or the alleged gas shortage, especially since the role that you once held at the Department for Trade and Industry has been merged with energy. There are some that believe that this issue of rising gas prices as a result of supply chain issues means that the net zero decarbonization agenda, which could in fact make gas more expensive, is needed more urgently, while others will argue that's the exact opposite of what's needed. What's your perspective on this issue?
Well, partly, of course, it's a worldwide issue following on from the pandemic, the sudden recovery of the economy. But in our case, it's self-inflicted in that we had the opportunity to develop our natural gas resources by fracking. Divine Providence has decreed that not only have we oil in the North Sea and gas in the South North Sea, which is largely exhausted, but huge quantities of gas potentially in the Bowland Shale in the northwest of England and in other parts of the UK. So we could have developed that and had cheap, plentiful gas, while possibly still phasing out fossil fuels in the future if people want to do that. But we're certainly going to need gas for a long while, and it would have been domestic gas rather than imported gas. So we missed that opportunity. We've aggravated it also by over-reliance on unreliable renewables, which for the last few weeks have been producing very little electricity. And unfortunately, the periods when they were producing plentiful electricity, you can't store it except at astronomical cost. So we've enhanced our own vulnerability and declined to take the opportunity to make ourselves self-sufficient in gas.
So effectively, the existing renewable energy sources that the country has been using is insufficient to make up for, if you would, the shortages that are going on all across the world, and also that exist within the United Kingdom. Would you say that?
Well, wind is splendid. Wind power is splendid when the wind blows, but in recent weeks it hasn't been blowing enough. Sun we don't have much of, and there's no use at night. It seems to have escaped some of the believers in renewables, but it's dark at night, and it's dark when the sun is hidden behind clouds. So they're relying on something intrinsically unreliable, and you need backup. And that backup has to be gas at present. And we haven't got that gas domestically, and it's hugely expensive to import.
Ah, I see. And I guess following up on the question, and also an issue that you've spoken a great deal about, which is the government's existing and long-standing, if you would, net zero agenda. What do you believe will be the implications of the net zero commitment on the cost of living for ordinary people?
Well, inevitably it will go up. It's a very costly program. The government, or rather Parliament, to put the blame where it truly lies, endorsed the commitment to move to net zero carbon emissions without any proper debate and without any proper costings. What we had was an assurance from the Climate Change Committee that they'd done the costings and that these showed that the cost was only $1 trillion or two. Only $1 trillion or two. I never thought I'd hear myself saying those words, but over 50 years, that sounded just about bearable. It's taken months of effort by the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which I used to be a trustee of, I'm not at the moment, to extract from the Climate Change Committee, the government's independent advisor, their workings. They refused. They went to great legal expense to try and prevent themselves having to reveal that under freedom of information rules, which itself is extraordinary. This body is supposed to advise us, refusing to tell us the basis of its own advice. They claimed they'd lost it. Imagine that. They'd lost it within a few days or weeks of having published the result. So then they admitted they'd got the original workings. They finally released them, and they've, just looking at the figures for electric cars, the cost is going to be far higher, or is already higher than they were predicting. So, you know, I wish electric cars were going to be very cheap and cheaper than petrol and diesel cars, because they are cleaner and simpler to run, and you know, it's much more logical to have electricity doing it if you could overcome the battery and the recharging problems, than having the controlled explosions, which is effectively what petrol and diesel are. But we're a long way from that, and we shouldn't pretend that it can all be done cheaply. The real cost will be making homes sufficiently insulated, replacing gas boilers by airborne heat pumps, which are very expensive, which only work if you insulate the house, because they won't give you very high temperatures of water, which is going to cost a fortune, which means every household in the country will have to spend tens of thousands of pounds. And that money can't just be magicked out of thin air or got from the rich. Ordinary people are going to have to pay for that. And once they do, the political problem will be immense. Whether or not you think it's right or wrong, people ought to look at what happens across the world in every case where the cost of meeting targets to reduce climate change has become a political issue, like in France, when President Macron raised the price of diesel fuel and sparked off the Gilets jaunes rebellion, he had to back down. In Australia, everybody thought the Conservative government, tired and in some ways discredited, wouldn't be re-elected, but when Labour made the promises to impose costs of moving to renewables, it got re-elected. In Canada, similar results. Even in the Netherlands, in their municipal elections, a party which hadn't previously existed, but which opposed higher costs of climate change, became the largest single party. So people do not want to pay for something where it's all based on some distant fear. Coupled with which, when you look at those distant fears, even taking seriously and at their word the most respected experts who tried to analyse the costs, in our case, Lord Stern. Only Sir Nicholas, when he was asked to do it by Gordon Brown, because he got his reward for peerage in due course. And his report is still the basis of our official climate change policy. And if you look at it closely, you'll see that in his estimates, the benefits of a slightly higher climate exceed the costs for the next century. And even if you move into the next century, by then on his worst case scenario, allowing for all sorts of unexpected events and tipping points and so on, that just means that people then, instead of being, I think it's 85% better off than we are now, instead of being 100% better off than now, we'll be 85% better off. In other words, there'll be a 15% loss of GDP, but a far higher GDP than we've got now still. So it's not nearly as frightening as people try to imagine. I put down a question asking the government whether they knew of any peer-reviewed science which suggested that if we did nothing about climate change, it would lead to the extinction of the human race. And they said, no, they didn't. The very name Extinction Rebellion of the principal lobby group was based on a lie. There's no threat of extinction. Or the worst, the threat of us not being as rich as we otherwise would be.
So you'd say that, I mean, where do you think the source of this sort of imbalance of views comes from? Because you're someone who's who himself has called for a sort of more consensual manner of looking at climate change. And there are a great deal of people today at many institutions who will argue that, okay, the prediction today, as of today, is that in 10 to 12 years' time, Miami will be underwater, everything will be on fire, and that there will be floods and natural disasters exasperated by climate change. Therefore, the most costly measures in the world are justified. So where do you think that sort of imbalance comes from?
It's partly that we are hardwired to be concerned about things going wrong, potential disasters. I suppose when we were hunter-gatherers, we were terrified that out of the darkness might come a saber-toothed tiger. So we took every precaution, even if it just turned out to be a little rabbit running through the undergrowth. So we're always looking for things that can go wrong. I think it was Macaulay said, how is it that when history shows never-ending progress, we nonetheless assume in the future never-ending disaster? So it's just part of human nature. But it's willful. People don't read the intergovernmental climate change reviews, the reviews of all the science that's been produced, which by and large are pretty good. The actual scientists very rarely lie. Their publications are then assessed by other scientists. And they say, for instance, of the greatest threat, which is the ice caps melting and the sea level rising by tens of meters, 100 meters ultimately, they say this will only happen over thousands of years. So it's not something imminent. It's not something that's going to happen 10 years in time in Miami. And I think over thousands of years, mankind will have solved these problems. We'll have harnessed nuclear fusion, we'll have costless energy, we'll be able to extract CO2 from the atmosphere if need be. So it's almost willful desire to foresee disaster. Why do some people want to see disaster apart from the psychological thing? It provides a wonderful excuse for those who wanted to control the economy and our lives in detail to do just that. Almost everything can be justified. Any control, any regulation, any constraint can be justified by saying, well, it's necessary to mitigate climate change. So it's a wonderful excuse for socialists to have socialism.
Makes sense. And I guess also on the question of the climate, you've obviously, and as I've said, you've described yourself as a global lukewarmist, and you seek a much more consensual approach that you want to hear from scientists you describe as either deniers or alarmists. Now, in a year where the British government is spending a great deal of money in pursuing this net zero agenda, where the Prime Minister sought to make his speech at the UN just 1 or 2 weeks ago about each country doing their bit for COP26, and where new targets are bound to be made, what kind of alternative approach would you advocate for come COP26?
Well, let's assume there is a real and serious problem if the world does nothing about mitigating carbon emissions. If that's the case, obviously we should try and persuade everybody to do something, to reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide. And we should play our part and even give a lead and all the other things. But supposing we fail, supposing the bulk of the world, China, India, Africa, and America, say, sorry, no, it's more important to those countries to have access to fossil fuel and electricity, cheap electricity, to industrialize and remove poverty than it is to reduce carbon emissions. So they're going to go ahead. In those circumstances, what we do is irrelevant. Once our example has been spurned and our self-abnegation has had no effect on others. So then we will have to adapt to whatever climate change occurs as a result of these emissions rising from the bulk of the population of the world. And it's sensible, therefore, to save our money for that purpose rather than to spend trillions of pounds making us carbon neutral, when if we achieve that, that reduces carbon emissions by 1%. 1% of the world's emissions, most 2% if you look at indirect effects. So we ought by all means, try and persuade others up until and during the COP26 to do what they think is the right thing. But once you've failed, there can be no justification for pursuing unilateral net zero. And then the important thing would be just to adapt. Actually, adaptation will probably be comparatively minor and a lot cheaper.
Understood. Now, moving on to...
Before we go any further, can I just make it absolutely clear? I'm not denying the science of global warming. I studied physics at Cambridge. There's absolutely no doubt if you double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, direct effect is to raise the temperature by about 1 degree, and there'll be indirect effects, which are much less certain, which could make it more than 1 degree, or even in certain circumstances less. It depends on the impact bubble of clouds. So that's why I'm a lukewarmist. I think the temperature probably will continue to rise if we continue to burn carbon dioxide, but not to an extent that makes the temperature likely to be unbearable to us. We survive, people have a civilized lifestyle in Helsinki and in Singapore, and the average temperature in those two cities differs by about 25 degrees, I think. So we can enjoy life in a wide range of temperatures.
Absolutely. I mean, I found it rather odd that I think there were several members of the House of Lords when you were appointed to the Environment and Climate Change Committee who said, oh, there's some problem with our constitution if Lord Lilley is able to sit on the Environment and Climate Change Committee because he's some sort of denier. And, given from what you said, you've never really shown to be a sort of climate denier. And it's pretty clear that you accept that there exists a change in global temperatures as a result of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, there were only two people with scientific degrees on the Climate Change and Energy and Climate Change Committee in the Commons, and we were the two skeptics. And we accepted the science, but we thought we were not alarmists anyway. We were skeptical of alarmism. Likewise, on the Lords Committee, there are only two people who studied physics, and we are the two who are most skeptical of the alarmists. All the rest have no scientific qualifications at all. They keep on telling us what the scientists say or what the science says. When I read out what the science says, they say, well, no, surely not everybody agrees with that. Well, that's what the IPCC says. Or whoever.
And I guess moving on to another issue, which you've also had a great deal of experience in, which is the issue of Conservative Party policy. We're now looking at a Conservative Party which, as of this month, is being seen as a high tax and a high spend party, whether it be the social care levy, which I believe you commented on earlier this month on GB News, and the massive spending that's taken place over the coronavirus pandemic. Do you see the party as heading in a Butskellite, if you would, direction in the long term? Or is the party just doing what is necessary, supposedly, for the moment as a result of the unprecedented coronavirus pandemic?
Well, there's certainly an element of the latter. During the pandemic, we were shutting down large swathes of the economy, depriving people of the opportunity of earning a living in those aspects of the economy. We had to compensate them, and so we had to print money to do it. And we could do so because across the economy generally, people were unable to spend all the money they had. And so they were accumulating money balances without, during that period, sparking off inflation. One hopes that when the pandemic's finally over, output will revert to what it was before. It's beginning to do so fairly rapidly. And growth will resume. And there'll be, I'm afraid, a burst of inflation because of that excess money in the system working its way through. But as long as we get back to some kind of old-style conservative attempts to balance budgets and control the money supply, things will be all right. The worry is that we've begun to imagine that there is a magic money tree, that you can forever print money and not raise taxes. You can't. Ultimately, if your spending is growing faster than the economy is growing, you will have to raise taxes. And that, of course, in turn, adversely affects growth. We will need higher spending in some public services as time goes by. the way to finance that is a growing economy. The way to ensure the economy doesn't grow is constantly to raise taxes. So we have a choice. Do we have expenditure rising in line with the growing economy or rising ahead of it and hitting that growth on the head?
Understood. And I guess also leading up on the question of social care, which at least in the first week of September proved a particularly controversial issue amongst conservatives, you wrote an op-ed in the Telegraph on what you believed ought to be the alternative to taxation-funded social care, writing that it could solve the crisis at a small fraction of a cost. What would be your alternative plan for social care for those who have not paid the subscription to the Telegraph?
Or bought my pamphlet free of charge from Civitas called Solving the Social Care Dilemma, towards a responsible solution, I think it's called, which I published some months ago, and people only began to take notice of it too late, when the government had already made up its mind. Essentially, there are two problems as far as social care is concerned. How do we pay for those who need social care but haven't got incomes or assets to pay for themselves? And over half of the cost of social care is for working age adults, people who've got disabilities, who nowadays are living longer than they used to in the past, which is good news. There's no way they can pay for themselves. They have to be paid by the taxpayer. We've been restraining expenditure on that area since the financial crisis in 2008. And it's really creaking at the seams. Something's got to be done about that, and that will require increased public expenditure, hopefully coming from increased economic growth. But when people talk about the need to reform social care, what they're talking about is an entirely different problem. What shall we do to alleviate the fear of homeowners, essentially, people with valuable assets, who ever since 1948, when the NHS was established, have been expected to pay for their own social care if they need it in old age. Healthcare is free, but social care has always been means tested, and if you've got assets, you're expected to pay for it. And people, not unnaturally, are worried that they or their parents will have to sell their homes and use the entire proceeds for the so-called catastrophic cost of social care. How can we deal with that? Well, it's essentially an insurable risk. Only a quarter of people do need social care in residential care. They, on average, need it for about 30 months. It costs £25,000 a year for the social care, the £10,000 a year for the hotel costs, on average. It can cost far more if you need dementia care and so on, but the average is that. So we ought to be able to do it. When the Dilnot Commission looked at the issue back in 2011, they found that the insurance companies said, nonetheless, we are not prepared to produce insurance policies for this risk, for two reasons. One, because they feared changes in government policy would, they were effectively insuring people against government policy requiring them to sell their houses, and the insurance companies couldn't insure against changes in that policy. And indeed, changes in medical science, which might keep people alive much, much longer, but in a frail state. The other, even probably more compelling reason was that they couldn't persuade people to pay for an insurance policy during their working lives on top of paying for their pensions and repaying their mortgages. So Dilnot and everybody else just ruled out the idea of insurance because the private companies wouldn't do it. But I said, well, if the private companies won't do it, I'm a free enterprise person, I prefer the private companies to do it, but if they're not going to, the government should set up a state-backed and guaranteed company that would do it. And, more important, they should enable people to insure at the point of retirement or soon after retirement by taking a charge on their homes. And on average, that charge would be £16,000, that order of magnitude. Smaller for a small house, bigger for a big house. and they would only have to pay that amount when they died or sold their house. So the rest of the money, the value of the house, they'd be able to pass on to their heirs. And it's the heirs who are most worried about this, because it's they who, if we didn't have such a system, or we didn't have the taxpayer taking on responsibility for paying for their care, will not get hold of a house worth, some cases, millions of pounds. And that seemed to me the sensible thing to do, but unfortunately, I sent copies of it to ministers way back, and then when it was published, sent it again. It wasn't drawn to the attention of ministers by officials who'd already made up their minds they were going for a higher tax option, sadly. So we're still plugging away, but I think the past has probably been sold by the government in promising to meet a very high proportion of the costs of social care, even for people with a £10 million house in Belgravia. Which seems to me perverse and not anything to do with levelling up. It will mean that people with no homes in the north of England, or a small home, will be subsidising people with large mansions in Belgravia.
Yeah, so I guess in principle that does very much appear quite unfair. And I remember a lot of opponents of the social care levy were referencing George Bush's famous words at the Republican National Convention, I think in 1988 or 87, in which he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and the consequences thereafter, when he realized that the reality was he simply couldn't do that.
Yeah.
Do you think that when it comes to the big conundrum of social care, and of course we'll be sure to put out a link to your published document later on, do you think on the question of social care, something like a superannuation system that Australia and New Zealand, or maybe even a central provident fund system that Singapore has, would be useful, would be a good alternative to this?
I'm not sure that, I don't know enough about the Australian and I've looked at the Singapore system in the past, but that's a radical change, which I don't think we're going to be making. I don't see why we need a radical overhaul of the whole system. We've got to accept that people with no money and very low incomes and no assets are going to have their social care paid for out of tax. You can label a bit of tax an insurance charge, which is what the government's done, but it's not insurance if it's not voluntary, and it's not related to the risks people incur. My system will be entirely voluntary. If you didn't want to insure your house against the risk of catastrophic costs of social care, you could take those risks, and if you happen to be one of the minority who do need a long period in social care, you'd have to sell your home, and your heirs wouldn't get an inheritance. And as someone said, no one was ever ruined by not having a large inheritance. A lot of people have been ruined by having a lot of money to squander, which they didn't earn, but their parents did. So I don't think we should go through a long and complex process to change our system if the end result is we're just calling a bit of tax insurance.
Understood. Now, on a different issue of Brexit and the European Union, you were one of the members of parliament, was it one of the few, in fact, members of parliament and ex-cabinet ministers who had spoken in favour of a leave vote back during the referendum, and over the course of the passing of the deal and the several unsuccessful deals that went through parliament. You might have heard some of the words of Michel Barnier, one of the new Republican candidates for the French presidency, who was the former Brexit chief negotiator on the EU side. What do you think his skepticism towards the European Union shows about the inner workings of the European Union and attitudes on the continent? Because there's always been this view that maybe it perhaps could, because of Britain's different experiences during the Second World War, that shaped the sort of inner Euroscepticism within British society. However, doesn't this sort of say something different?
Yes, I mean, it is rather extraordinary that he should have been such an arch exponent of the European idea while he was a negotiator for the European Union. As soon as he wants to become return to domestic politics in France, he suddenly feels it necessary to play to quite a large Eurosceptic constituency in France, but it's a different sort of Euroscepticism in France. I'm very pro-French. I have a house over in France and spend most of my free time there. And I meet people who describe themselves as in favour of Frexit, but then I don't think they're ever going to be a majority. France has always seen that those of a Eurosceptic inclination tend to sublimate it by a belief that France can somehow lead Europe, and Europe will be just simply a continuation of France by other means. They're obviously upset about immigration. They're primarily from North Africa and not from the rest of Europe. So he's playing to that by saying that France should leave the Schengen or abandon Schengen controls so that it can restrict immigration from both from the rest of Europe and from the rest of the world. It won't happen, and he won't even, I fear, get the nomination. Actually, I think he'd probably be as good a candidate as any and as good a president of France as any from the British point of view. Any French president is going to play to the gallery, and that involves making anti-British noises. So all the potential candidates will sound anti-British from time to time. You just have to put up with that.
And so I was quite amused by his admission back in, I think, February, or during the successful British vaccine program, in which he admitted that maybe the EU had constrained the vaccine program due to numerous reasons that we already know of. But it is quite amusing to see how he placed the gallery in a very different context. Well, thank you very much for speaking to us, Lord Lilley. I think that many of us will very much agree with your views, and well, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
You and the Bruges Group.
Thank you very much.